Welcome everyone, good morning, good evening and good afternoon. What do we have with us today at the eve of the reset that brings us the creation catalyst for NA is today, for EU is going to be tomorrow. What we have for today is a journey between fantasy and reality. What I'm talking about is today we are going to be looking at what do the simulations tell us, what did the simulations tell us about 9.2 when it comes to the damage that the specs are supposed to be doing, when it comes to the burst damage that the specs are supposed to be doing, when it comes to the damage taken by tanks, when it comes to the actions per minute, how many buttons each spec is pressing every minute in this patch, even down to looking at the DPS variance of each spec, meaning how much wildly can the DPS change for each spec. Perhaps there are specs that do much more the same damage compared to others that can be more, I guess, volatile in the damage they can do. We can go back and compare it to 9.1.5, compare it to Sanctum of Domination to see how wildly the meta, the damage that these specs are supposed to do has changed since we have gotten more borrowed powers. We can also look at reality. What is the difference? What are the differences between the reality of the logs, the reality of the kills in the raid compared to what the simulations are telling us that these specs should perform? So what we are starting with, of course, is purely just the damage. The simulation of how much DPS each class and spec is supposed to have. Obviously, at the bottom you would see mostly tanks, because they are doing the least damage compared to pure DPS specs, right? So that's not a surprise, all the tank specs sitting at the bottom. What we see, however, at the top is Enhancement Shaman, followed by Frost Mage, Elemental Shaman, Necrolord, Demonology Warlock, Red Paladin, Fire Mage, Balance Druid, Shadow Priest, and then Fury and Subtlety Rogue. Now, amongst these names and amongst these numbers, the one that probably surprises people the most is obviously, well, Red Paladin, the pink one. Perhaps most of the other specs you have already seen and you have already dealt with the damage they can do. Red Paladin, however, perhaps not as much. Perhaps this comes out as a little bit more of a weird placement for Red Paladin. Another funny, but at the same time depressing thing that we see at the bottom is the absolute state of Windwalker Monk. We already knew Windwalker Monk had shit single target damage, but to the point that Blood Death Knight is now currently out damaging them. It's quite a sad situation when you see a tank doing more damage than a pure, I guess, DPS spec. Yes, that obviously has more to do with how broken the damage now of Blood Death Knight is, particularly in, consistent damage windows, not as much as the burst window, but still. Now, outside of the top and the bottom, the middle pack, there's gonna be way too much to go over, so instead what we do is compare it immediately to what we have seen in 9.1.5, what we have seen in Sanctum of Domination in terms of, damage that specs are supposed to be doing. Because when we compare this to last tier, what is consistent with last tier is that supposedly Enhancement Shaman, as well as Fury Warrior, Fire Mage, Frost Mage, Subtlety Rogue, were all towards the top already. So between last tier to this tier, 2-piece set bonus, 4-piece set bonus, double legendary, changes in covenants and whatnot, these specs have remained supposedly to have a very high overall single target damage. The biggest jumps, we can say, the biggest leaps in terms of damage, the biggest improvements in this patch are at the moment Elemental Shaman, which you can see jumping essentially from middle of the pack to top 3. That's very, very big. We also see Balance Druid. This is quite more complicated because we have gone over the raid situation every week and we constantly see Balance Druid at the bottom. This is something we will see when we compare the simulations with real life, and the Balance Druid compared to last year has gotten a significant improvement. The other improvement is of course to Blood Death Knight, which last patch was supposed to be the least damaging of the tanks and even all the specs together with Vengeance, and now is instead even beating certain DPS specs. Another one of the significant leaps compared to last tier are Frost Death Knight, that we have gone over already in the raid and even in Mythic Plus. They are now more popular, they are now more viable compared to last year, certainly. The other change was the slow but quite visible decline of all three of the rogue specs. You can see that subtlety is still towards the top, but not as much as last year, and then both outlaw and assassination have dropped quite a bit. Outlaw in particular, massive drop for outlaw in single target. You can see anyways for yourself most of the other changes in what the simulations are telling us should be the best performers when it comes to at least single target. Another interesting tidbit when it comes to damage, this one perhaps is more relevant for more, I guess, in-depth look, which is burst damage, right? The burst damage at the very least here when it comes to single target. So the burst damage situation at the moment, this is with double legendary of course, it's tier set bonuses enabled of course. The burst damage at the moment is, what a surprise, completely dominated by Van tier balanced druid, right? This is not too big of a surprise. When we go below, okay, when we just ignore the balanced druid, what is after balanced druid when it comes to burst damage is Unholy Death Knight, Frost Death Knight, Red Paladin, and then Arcane Mage, Enhancement, Shaman, and Fire Mage. So already this is somewhat interesting. We can even add to the mix something like Assassination Rogue, which is not really something you think of when someone tells you about burst damage, right? Assassination is not really jumping in your head when you hear that. Also worth mentioning, just like we did for the overall DPS, that even when it comes to burst damage, we do see Blood Death Knight beating Havoc Demon Hunter as a DPS spec. Yeah, Havoc, especially in single target, does not have a very good burst. In AoE it gets a little bit better, but in single target it's quite abysmal. Towards the bottom of burst, of course, you see specs that don't really have very powerful cooldown, because that's what burst means. So you see all of the warrior specs, basically. You see Elemental Shaman, you see Subtlety Rogue, Outlaw Rogue. Frost Mage is another spec known for not really having strong burst when it comes to single target. So this is the situation, at least what simulations tell us that the strongest burst should be. Again, we can go and take a look at the last patch, we can go and take a look at Sanctum to look at what we were used to when thinking about burst. Obviously, Arcane Mage and Fire Mage and Balanced Druid and Unholy Death Knight are all still there. There isn't really much change when it comes to single target burst damage. The main change here, brought to us of course by borrowed powers in this patch, are the massive rise of Assassination Rogue compared to last patch, as well as the massive rise, even larger actually, than Enhancement Shaman compared to last patch. At the same time, a few other specs have lost in their burst damage when it comes to single target. For example, Marksmanship is getting a bit lower compared to last patch, at the cost of Beast Mastery actually passing them in this patch. Quite a significant growth of Beast Mastery compared to last tier. Now, this is of course still mostly just theoretical. So if you're playing perfectly and the target is stationary, it's basically a target dummy, then this is what you should see when it comes to burst damage. But what are some other cool things we can look at when it comes to this type of statistics? One is the DPS variance. DPS variance, very simply, means how likely it is, what is the largest difference in performance that you can have in a spec. This could be a couple of things. One, it could be taking into account the skill level, the difficulty level of the spec. So perhaps, of course, a very simple spec is going to have low variance, because even if you mess up the rotation, it's not going to be as punishing. Meanwhile, another spec could have higher variance, because if you mess up the rotation in some important parts, it could be a disaster. Think about a Van tier balanced druid messing up their Sinful Hysteria burst window, right? The other point that could change the variance is the RNG. How many procs, random chances, and dependence of RNG the spec has. So it could be a mix of both. It could be a mix of whether or not it has a lot of RNG, or whether or not it is more skill intensive compared to other specs. So what we see in the DPS variance is that specs like Elemental, Assassination, Beast Mastery, Affliction are all towards the bottom of the variance. So in the case of these specs is that because they are quite simple, the rotation is quite straightforward, so messing it up is not going to be as punishing, and also there isn't too much RNG either in these specs. Compare it to the top which is Arcane Mage, which is Ventir, Balanced Druid, which is Red Paladin, which is Survival Hunter, Destruction Warlock, and Enhancement Shaman. These specs have the largest variance in the damage they can do. Whether or not it's because of the RNG and the random chances in their build, or because it is more punishing, because it is more complex. It requires more of a precise knowledge of the rotation to perform better for these specs. Another interesting thing we can look between now and last patch is the APM. TLDR, how fast are specs playing? How fast are they playing right now, and how fast were they playing last tier? The first thing I want to look at, I want to make you aware of, is that between last tier and this tier, specs on average became faster by about 3 to 5 abilities per minute. This of course can have to do with the increase in your haste, increase in perhaps in things you can cast and do because of your 2-piece and 4-piece set bonuses, etc, etc. So this tier, the fastest button pressing specs are Protection and Fury Warrior, followed by Protection Paladin, Havoc, Demon Hunter, Blood Death Knight, Outlaw Rogue, Subtlety Rogue, Frost Mage, Vengeance, and Guardian Druid. Now obviously, much like in the DPS it was more logical to see tank specs at the bottom, in the APM it is more logical to see tank specs at the top, because tank specs also have mitigation abilities. Many of their mitigation abilities for the tanks are not on the GCD, which means you can press them extra on top of your normal abilities, which overall evens out to be more button presses. So obviously tanks are towards the top. Other specs that have been notoriously button press heavy, like Fury Warrior, are still there. Outlaw Rogue is still there, and the usual outlier of the range specs was Frost Mage. Even when we go and look at last tier, this has not really changed. Besides the tank specs being towards the top and the Frost Mage being towards the top as well, the more shocking change, I guess, hand in hand with their damage increase, is the button press increase of Blood Death Knight. Because even though we said that tanks used to have lots of button presses because they are tanks, the outlier in the last patch was Blood Death Knight. Blood Death Knight does not really have as many off the GCD abilities. It mostly plays like a DPS, except their main ability heals them, Deathstrike. So up to Sanctum, their button press level was quite average. It was 53 per minute, which was even towards the bottom half of the DPS and tank specs. Now, Blood Death Knight is towards the top. They went from 53 to 70. A significant increase in how much stuff you have to smash on your Blood Death Knight. Other specs have remained quite true to their nature. Not too many button presses. Elemental Shaman is a good old spec for not pressing too many buttons. Arcane Mage, of course. We can't forget Arcane Mage, still at the absolute bottom of the button presses. Feral Druid is another spec that doesn't press that many buttons. Assassination Rogue. Even if now Assassination has been shown to have simulations, at least, high burst damage in single target, their button presses are still quite low. Windwalker Monk is another spec that has low button presses. Outside of their burst window, their downtime is quite boring. So that's another one. Demolock, the very meta and flavor of the month Demolock, still doesn't have too many button presses in this patch, just like they didn't have them last patch. Not too many other major changes when we go and look at the button presses that specs are supposed to be having in this patch. To put this better in perspective, button presses also go hand in hand with your downtime. So literally, how many seconds, how much time in your fight you won't be pressing anything. You will be essentially waiting for your cooldowns, waiting for your resources, for your combo points, for your energy, rage, whatever you have. Of course, the main culprit and standout spec this time, both from this patch, last patch, this tier, last tier, doesn't matter, the winner is always Feral Druid. Feral Druid is still averaging about 25% of their combat time being about rolling their thumbs and not doing much of anything else. The other two on the podium for both tiers are Assassination and Windwalker. Most of the other stuff is obviously melee DPS and much less casters, because of course casters can cast. So if you cast, you're not gonna have downtime. How can you have downtime as a mage? You can still cast something, you can still use your fireball, just like a shaman can still use lightning bolt, so their downtime is really hard to to be there. Meanwhile, melee DPS can have more downtime, of course, because they are not as cooldown based, they are more resource based, so they find themselves more often having to wait for resources to play, essentially. The only outlier in here is, of course, Beast Mastery, which is a ranged melee DPS. Basically, it works closer to a melee spec than a caster, so he is there as well. To close this window on DPS and their damage they're supposed to be doing from a simulation, from a perfect play compared to real time, real life, I wanted to compare this obviously with real life. So I took the closest thing we can get to a target dummy single target fight in Sepulcher, which is Skolex, and then I compared it with what the simulations are telling us. We can see some trends, okay? When we look at Skolex is telling us that Elemental Shaman, Demonology Warlock, Shadow Priest, Frost Mage, Fire Mage, and Enhancement Shaman are in the top 6. When we look at the top 6 according to simulations, we see Enhancement, we see Frost Mage, we see Fire Mage, we see Demonology Warlock, we see Elemental, and we see Ret Paladin. So pretty much 5 out of 6 are respecting what the sims are telling us. The only outlier here is Ret. Yeah, Ret in the simulations is replaced by Shadow Priest in real life. Even then, Shadow Priest is very close anyways to the top of single target damage. Ret is closer towards the middle. Ret is beaten by Assassination, Ret is beaten by Subtlety, is beaten by Feral, and is beaten by Unholy, as well as, of course, Enhancement when it comes to melee DPS. So, Ret Paladin in the simulations is, quite a bit higher than Unholy, and then significantly higher than Assassination, and catastrophically higher than specs like Feral. So, that's interesting. It's an interesting situation for Ret. So we can see that more or less the simulation is being somewhat true. Even when we go towards the bottom, you have Windwalker, Arms Warrior, Frost, Survival. These specs are not too good in single target, and when we look at the simulations and what they are telling us, they are also not doing too well. The only Frost DK specs doing better in single target is the two-handed version, which is not what we are seeing here in the fight. So overall, what the simulation is telling us is more or less following up in real life when it comes to single target. Obviously, when we move away from Skolex and we start looking at different fights, the overall look can be much more different and varied because it's not just pure single target. But it's good to see that more or less they are respecting what the simulations were predicting, I guess. So what we are finishing the video with after this entire list, this entire marathon of bars and numbers and stats, is a little bit of a tank info. This one is about the burst damage, the maximum burst damage taken that the tanks can sustain, essentially. We can see that there is quite the difference between the top and the bottom. The difference between the Brewmaster, Blood DK, and Prot Paladin compared to Vengeance and Guardian Druid. Yeah, this should have been quite visible to you already if you have been doing, for example, Mythic Plus keys, or even just observed how tanks take damage, right? You see that Brewmaster Monk not having very powerful cooldowns but having very smooth damage is much more at risk of high spikes of damage. Protection Paladin also is kind of looks a little bit squishy, but can be quite self-sufficient, just like Blood Death Knight, which again looks like it's made of paper and constantly drops low, but that's kind of what they want to do, and then heal themselves back up. Meanwhile, Guardian Druid kind of doesn't care. Guardian Druid just stands still and takes a bunch of damage because of how tanky it is. Their stats they can have when they play, not necessarily Ventir, even their Nightfare version is just as fine in taking damage, in tanking damage, especially this particular raid version, which uses Legacy of the Sleeper, which makes them even more tanky in single target. So this was the overall situation when we go and look at simulation and we compare it to real life. I thought it was interesting. I thought we would have seen some nice, interesting little bit of info, tidbits, trivia about how the situation has been going so far. Perhaps give you some info, give you some knowledge on the burst damage of the specs, the single target damage of the specs, how fast or how slow specs are. Perhaps some of you did not know any of this. Perhaps some of you rightfully did not know because they did not care. And the moment they close this video, they will forget. But at least for some 20 minutes, you knew about it. I thought it was cool and it was interesting. So this is what we have gone over for today. Tomorrow being Wednesday, we're gonna have the reset. We're gonna have a very good Mythic Plus week. So we will go and talk a little bit about that, as well as of course opening the Great Vault on the day finally that the Creation Catalyst opens. So you can kind of get, you know, double piece of gear in this reset because of the Great Vault plus the Creation Catalyst. It's gonna be a quite upgrade heavy week for many players. With this being said and done, we can leave each other. We can leave each other to the rest of the start of this reset. Thank you, of course, for watching the video and for helping to grow and support the channel. You can support it even more by liking and commenting on the video, as well as subscribing to the channel. No limitations for today. You can also follow me up on Twitter as well as supporting me on Patreon over here. Honestly, thank you anyways for the support. Even just watching the videos is enough. That being said, I have to leave now. I have to go out and shop for some groceries. I've been out all weekend, so thank you guys again. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, before going out, however, I need to get something for my throat. Like here, it kind of hurts at the moment, so it's